March 4, 2008. It was an ordinary evening in Auburn, Alabama. Students were studying for exams, coffee shops were crowded. The university library was filled with students preparing for midterms. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, shortly after 9 p.m., everything changed. A frantic 911 call came into dispatch. The caller reported seeing a young woman standing in the middle of a highway. She appeared injured. She was partially clothed, and she was desperately trying to stop passing cars. Within moments, more calls flooded in. Drivers described the same terrifying scene: a young woman screaming for help, running into traffic, trying to survive. Then some witnesses reported hearing gunshots. Police immediately rushed to the area. But when officers arrived, they were too late. The woman was lying motionless on the roadway. Several drivers had stopped their vehicles to shield her from oncoming traffic. Paramedics worked desperately to save her. At first, they believed she had been struck by a car, but a closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. She had been shot. The bullet had torn through her body, causing catastrophic injuries. She was rushed to the hospital. Hours later, she died. Investigators immediately faced a troubling problem. The victim had no identification, no wallet, no driver's license, nothing that revealed who she was. For several hours, she remained a mystery, an unidentified young woman whose final moments had unfolded in front of dozens of witnesses. Then another emergency call came in, this time from Auburn University. A car was on fire in a campus parking lot. At first, the two incidents seemed unrelated, but investigators would soon discover that the burned vehicle belonged to the young woman found on the highway. Her name was Lauren Burk, an 18-year-old college freshman. And what happened during the hour between leaving her boyfriend's dorm and appearing on that highway would become one of the most shocking murder investigations in Auburn's history. Before she became the center of a murder investigation, Lauren Burk was simply an 18-year-old college freshman. She had recently begun her first year at Auburn University. Friends described her as kind, creative, and easy to talk to. She loved art, enjoyed sports, and was studying graphic design, like many freshmen. She was excited about the future. On the evening of March 4, 2008, Lauren spent time with her boyfriend, Sean, at his dormitory. According to Sean, the evening was mostly normal. The two talked, relaxed, and prepared for upcoming exams. Around 8 p.m., Lauren left the dorm and headed toward her car. She was supposed to meet friends at the library for a study session. The drive would have taken only a few minutes, but Lauren never arrived. As time passed, her friends became concerned. They called her phone several times. Eventually, Lauren answered. One friend asked where she was and why she hadn't shown up. Lauren replied that she had forgotten about the study session. The friend suggested they meet another day. Then Lauren responded with 3 words: "I don't know." The answer seemed strange, cold, unnatural. Unlike the Lauren her friends knew, the call ended moments later. At the time, nobody thought much about it. But investigators would later wonder if Lauren was trying to communicate something she couldn't say directly. Perhaps she wasn't alone. Perhaps someone was listening. Perhaps she was already in danger. While police worked to identify the young woman found on the highway, another discovery changed the investigation completely. A black Honda was burning in a university parking lot. Firefighters quickly extinguished the flames. The vehicle had been deliberately set on fire. Someone wanted to destroy evidence. When detectives traced the registration, they contacted the owner. The car belonged to Lauren's father. Within hours, Lauren's family arrived in Auburn. Soon afterward, the heartbreaking confirmation came. The unidentified victim on the highway was Lauren Burk. The burned Honda was hers. Now, investigators knew they were dealing with more than a shooting. Someone had abducted Lauren. Someone had taken control of her vehicle. And after she died, that person had gone to great lengths to erase the evidence. Inside the burned Honda, detectives found another critical clue. a .38 caliber bullet, the same caliber believed to have been used in the attack. The two crime scenes were now connected, but one question remained unanswered. What happened during the hour between Lauren leaving Sean's dorm and appearing on that dark stretch of highway? Investigators didn't know yet, but the answer would eventually come from something surprisingly small: a missing bank card. At first, investigators had very little to work with. Lauren was dead, her car had been burned, and the person responsible seemed to have vanished without a trace. But while examining the remains of Lauren's Honda, detectives noticed something unusual. Her wallet had been found inside the vehicle. Some personal items had survived the fire, yet several of Lauren's bank cards were missing. It seemed like a small detail, but investigators immediately recognized its potential importance. If the killer had taken the cards, there was a chance he would try to use them, and if he did, he might leave a trail. Police quickly contacted Lauren's banks and requested all recent transaction records. Days later, the first breakthrough arrived. One of Lauren's cards had been used shortly after she was found on the highway. The transaction occurred at a gas station, not far from the route connecting the crime scene and Auburn. That discovery revealed something disturbing. After Lauren had been shot and left behind, someone was still using her property. Someone was moving around in her vehicle. Someone who clearly wasn't worried about getting caught. Investigators rushed to obtain surveillance footage. Unfortunately, the video quality was poor. The suspect's face couldn't be clearly identified. Once again, the case seemed stuck. Then another transaction appeared. This time, hundreds of miles away in Virginia, Lauren's stolen card had been used again. Detectives immediately collected surveillance footage from the second location. The images still weren't perfect, but they provided the first meaningful description of a possible suspect. Witnesses and investigators believed the person using the card was a young black male. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had before. Meanwhile, fear spread across Auburn University. Students followed every update. Parents called their children. Many students stopped walking alone at night. An 18-year-old freshman had been abducted, shot, and left on the side of a highway, and nobody knew who would be next. As pressure mounted, additional agencies joined the investigation. The FBI became involved. State police offered assistance. Hundreds of tips poured in from across the region. Most led nowhere. Then, investigators noticed something interesting. Around the same time, Lauren's stolen bank card was moving across state lines. A series of violent robberies began occurring in Georgia. The crimes seemed unrelated at first. Different victims, different locations, different investigators. But there was one detail that caught attention. The suspect appeared to be moving along the same general route connected to Lauren's stolen property. At that point, nobody knew if the connection was real. It could have been coincidence, or it could have been the first sign that Lauren's killer was still committing crimes. What detectives didn't realize was that the robber would soon make a critical mistake. A mistake that would expose his identity and lead investigators directly to the man they had been searching for. His name was Courtney Lockhart. While investigators in Alabama searched for Lauren's killer, police in Georgia were dealing with a completely different problem. A series of armed robberies. At first, the cases seemed unrelated, but that was about to change. On March 5th, just one day after Lauren's murder, a woman was walking through a parking lot in Georgia when a man approached her with a handgun. He demanded her belongings. Within seconds, he disappeared. The following day, another woman became a victim. This time, the robber threatened not only her, but also her child. Again, he escaped. Police suspected the same offender was responsible. Then came the third attack, and everything escalated. A 72-year-old woman was walking to her vehicle outside a Walmart when a man suddenly appeared behind her. He struck her with a handgun, then forced her into her own car. What had started as robbery had now become kidnapping, but the attacker made one crucial mistake. Someone saw everything. A witness immediately realized something was wrong and began following the vehicle from a distance. The kidnapper noticed. Panic set in. Afraid of being caught, he abandoned the elderly woman and fled. To him, it was simply a desperate escape. To investigators, it became the break they desperately needed. The Walmart parking lot was covered by surveillance cameras. Detectives quickly reviewed the footage. For the first time, they captured a clear image of the suspect's vehicle. More importantly, they obtained the license plate number. Within minutes, investigators traced the registration. The vehicle was linked to Lee County, Alabama, not far from Auburn, not far from where Lauren Burk had been murdered. That immediately caught investigators' attention. Authorities in Georgia contacted law enforcement in Alabama. As they compared notes, similarities began to emerge. The descriptions matched, the suspect's behavior matched, and the timeline matched. For the first time, investigators began to wonder if they were searching for the same man. A statewide alert was issued. Police officers were instructed to watch for the vehicle. Then, less than 30 minutes later, an officer spotted it. The car was traveling through Phoenix City. The officer activated his lights and initiated a traffic stop. The driver pulled over. At first, everything appeared normal. The officer approached the vehicle and began checking the registration. Almost immediately, he realized. This was the car investigators had been searching for. The officer informed the driver that detectives wanted to speak with him. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the driver attacked. The officer was caught completely off guard before backup could arrive. The suspect jumped back into the vehicle and sped away. A high-speed pursuit erupted. Police sirens filled the night. The suspect pushed his vehicle harder and harder, desperate to escape. But during that chase, investigators finally learned his name: Courtney Lockhart. At the time, he was wanted only in connection with the robberies. No one yet knew he might also be connected to the murder of Lauren Burk. But that was about to change, because once the chase ended and investigators searched his vehicle, they would discover something that should never have been there. Something that belonged to Lauren. And that discovery would turn Courtney Lockhart from a robbery suspect into the prime suspect in a murder investigation. After the high-speed chase ended, Courtney Lockhart was finally in custody. At that moment, investigators believed they had caught a violent robbery suspect. Nothing more. No one was talking about Lauren Burk. No one was discussing the Auburn murder. As far as most officers knew, the two cases were completely unrelated. Then, detectives began searching Courtney's vehicle. At first, they found exactly what they expected: cash, personal property, items that appeared to be connected to the recent robberies. But then an investigator noticed something tucked beneath a seat. A small electronic device. It looked ordinary, just another piece of stolen property. But when detectives examined it more closely, everything changed. It was an iPod. And it belonged to Lauren Burk. The room fell silent within seconds. Investigators realized what they were looking at. The man arrested after the police chase was carrying property belonging to a murdered college student. Immediately, homicide investigators in Alabama were notified. But the discoveries didn't stop there. As the search continued, detectives found another item, a cell phone, and once again it belonged to Lauren. Now there was no reasonable explanation, no coincidence, no misunderstanding. Courtney Lockhart had been in possession of multiple items stolen from Lauren after her death. For the first time since the investigation began, detectives felt they were finally getting close to the truth. Courtney was brought in for questioning. Investigators wanted one simple answer: how did he obtain Lauren's belongings? But his explanations made little sense. At first, he claimed he had purchased some of the items. Later, he changed his story. Then he said he couldn't remember where they came from. Each version contradicted the one before it. The more he spoke, the more suspicious he became. Experienced detectives noticed a pattern. Every time they challenged one explanation, Courtney offered another. Yet, none of them explained why Lauren's personal property was found in his possession only days after her murder. Meanwhile, forensic experts were working around the clock. They examined everything recovered from the vehicle, every item, every fingerprint, every trace of evidence. Investigators also began reviewing Courtney's movements after Lauren disappeared. The timeline was troubling. Shortly after Lauren was murdered, Courtney was linked to multiple robberies. Lauren's bank cards had been used. Her property had traveled across state lines, and now her belongings were sitting inside Courtney's car. Piece by piece, the evidence was beginning to form a clear picture, but detectives still needed to answer the biggest question. Was Courtney merely a thief who possessed stolen property? Or was he the man who had abducted Lauren, shot her, and left her to die on the side of a highway? The answer would come from the forensic evidence, because investigators were now examining a weapon linked to Courtney, a weapon they believed could connect him directly to the murder. If the tests confirmed their suspicions, the case would change forever, and Courtney Lockhart would no longer be viewed as a suspect. He would be identified as Lauren Burk's killer. By the time investigators focused entirely on Courtney Lockhart, they had accumulated a substantial amount of evidence. Lauren's iPod, Lauren's cell phone, her stolen bank cards, the suspicious transactions, and Courtney's constantly changing stories. But one question still haunted everyone involved in the case. Why Lauren? Was she specifically targeted, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? After months of investigation, prosecutors developed a theory that would eventually be presented in court. They did not believe Lauren knew her attacker, nor did they believe the crime had been carefully planned in advance. Instead, they believed Lauren became a victim of opportunity, an ordinary college student whose path crossed with a violent criminal looking for money. According to investigators, everything likely began shortly after Lauren left Sean's dormitory. She walked toward her black Honda. She was thinking about a study session, thinking about exams, thinking about tomorrow. She had no reason to believe her life was in danger. But somewhere nearby, Courtney Lockhart was searching for a victim, a man carrying a gun, a man already willing to commit violent crimes, a man growing increasingly desperate. Prosecutors believed Courtney approached Lauren moments after she entered her vehicle. Using a firearm, he took control of the situation. What happened next may never be fully known. There were no surviving witnesses, no recordings, no confession, only evidence. And the evidence suggested that Lauren remained alive for nearly an hour. For almost 60 minutes, she was trapped inside a nightmare, driven away from campus, separated from friends and family, unable to call for help. Investigators believe the strange phone call to her friend occurred during this period, the call in which Lauren answered with only 3 words, "I don't know." Years later, many investigators remained convinced that something was wrong during that conversation. The words sounded forced, restricted, as though Lauren wanted to say more but couldn't, as though someone was right beside her. Then, at some point, the situation escalated. Prosecutors believed Courtney intended to rob Lauren, to take her money, her bank cards, her electronics. But Lauren presented a problem. She could identify him. She could testify. She could send him to prison. And according to prosecutors, that is when Courtney made a decision that changed 2 lives forever. He fired a single shot. The bullet caused devastating injuries. But what happened next stunned investigators. Lauren didn't die immediately. Despite her wounds, she somehow managed to escape. She got out of the vehicle. She ran. She searched desperately for help. That is why witnesses saw her on the highway. That is why multiple 911 calls flooded dispatch. That is why strangers watched in horror as she stumbled through the darkness, fighting to stay alive. Even after everything she had endured, Lauren refused to give up. For a few final moments, she was still fighting for survival, still hoping someone could save her, still trying to make it home. But the injuries were simply too severe. Her body could no longer continue, and eventually she collapsed while Lauren fought for her life. Courtney fled. He took her belongings, used her bank cards, then returned to Auburn and set her Honda on fire. Investigators believed the purpose was simple: destroy the evidence, erase the crime, disappear before anyone could connect him to Lauren. But instead of disappearing, Courtney continued committing robberies. And with every crime, he left behind another clue, another mistake, another piece of evidence. By the time police arrested him, the truth was already beginning to surface. Now investigators needed only one final thing: scientific proof, the kind of evidence that could convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And soon, forensic experts would provide exactly that. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they knew one thing: possessing Lauren's property was powerful evidence. But they needed more. They needed proof that would leave little room for doubt. That proof came from forensic investigators. Experts examined every piece of evidence connected to the case: Lauren's belongings, the burned Honda, the stolen bank cards, and most importantly, a firearm linked to Courtney Lockhart. Ballistics experts compared evidence from the crime scene with test rounds fired from the weapon. The process was painstaking. Every microscopic mark left by the barrel was analyzed. Every detail was examined. The results supported what investigators had suspected for months. The evidence pointed directly toward Courtney Lockhart. Meanwhile, detectives reconstructed his movements after Lauren's disappearance. The timeline was devastating. Lauren's property appeared in Courtney's possession. Her bank cards were used after her death. Her electronics were recovered from his vehicle. And throughout the investigation, Courtney never offered a believable explanation for any of it. The evidence continued to grow, piece by piece, fact by fact, until prosecutors believed they had enough to bring the case before a jury. More than 2 years after Lauren's murder, the trial finally began. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Lauren's family sat only a short distance away from the man accused of taking her life. For them, every day of testimony reopened old wounds. Prosecutors carefully presented the timeline: Lauren leaving Sean's dorm, the mysterious phone call, the highway, the burned Honda, the stolen bank cards, the robberies, the police chase, and the discovery of Lauren's belongings inside Courtney's vehicle. Witnesses took the stand. Investigators testified. Forensic experts explained the evidence. One by one, the pieces came together. The defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's case. They spoke about Courtney's troubled upbringing, his military service, his struggles after returning from Iraq. But the prosecution argued that none of those factors changed the facts. Lauren Burk was dead, and the evidence pointed to one person. Then came one of the most emotional moments of the trial. Lauren's family addressed the court. They didn't speak about evidence. They didn't discuss legal arguments. Instead, they spoke about Lauren, the daughter they lost, the sister who would never come home, the young woman who would never have the future she deserved. No graduation, no career, no family of her own. Everything had been taken away in a single night. Many people in the courtroom struggled to hold back tears because behind every piece of evidence was a real person, an 18-year-old student whose life ended far too soon. Finally, the case was handed to the jury. The wait felt endless. Then the verdict arrived. Courtney Lockhart was found guilty for Lauren's family. The moment brought mixed emotions: relief, gratitude, and overwhelming sadness. Justice had been served, but Lauren was still gone. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors sought the harshest punishment available. After considering the evidence, the jury recommended a sentence of death. The judge accepted that recommendation. Courtney Lockhart was sentenced to death. For many people, that marked the end of the case. But for Lauren's family, the loss never truly ended. Years later, they continued honoring her memory, not as a victim, but as a young woman full of potential, a daughter, a friend, a student with dreams that were never given the chance to become reality. Perhaps the most haunting part of this case is how ordinary it began. Lauren wasn't taking a dangerous trip. She wasn't entering a high-risk situation. She was simply driving to meet friends for a study session, something millions of students do every day. Yet within a single hour, her life changed forever. And perhaps that is why the Lauren Burk case continues to resonate with so many people. Because it reminds us how quickly an ordinary moment can become a tragedy, and how one encounter with the wrong person at the wrong time can alter countless lives forever. Lauren Burk fought for her life until the very end, and that is how many people choose to remember her. Not for the way she died, but for the courage she showed in her final moments.